Okay, everyone can hear me now?
Yes.
Good. So the course is Renaissance Humanism. We're going to be here for 4 weeks. The first session is going to be essentially background and something of an explanation of why the cultural event begins, where it begins, and when it begins. And with just a hint at some of the content we're going to be looking at. In the second session, we're going to be looking at what has come to be called the Studia Humanitatis, really the curriculum, the study of the humanities. And the topics are going to be the Renaissance obsession with text and the relationship between humanism and new educational assumptions that became popularized throughout Italy during the Renaissance, with departures in every which direction, as you know I'm used to doing. In the third session, which I believe is going to be the single best session, if there is such a thing, because we're going to look at all the extreme elements that suddenly invaded Renaissance thought. I've sort of grouped them under the term eclecticism. I wanted to also use the word syncretism, which is too jargony to use right now, but the word will be used later on when we start talking about what that might mean. And we're going to be looking at the rediscovery of Plato, the Neoplatonists, magic traditions, astrology, alchemy, the Kabbalah, the use of memory palaces and memory techniques, which became very popular during the period, and the like. So it's going to cover what my mother used to call a jambot, one big vegetable stew that had a little bit of anything that was in the kitchen refrigerator thrown in. And the fourth session, I'd like to look at what I've called here the nature of man, theories about human nature, particular focus on Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who is the boy wonder of the Renaissance, the brilliant young man who died way before his time was due, and who was infected by every current that moved through the Renaissance. Niccolo Machiavelli, who you may or may not have been exposed to already, and he's a tough act to follow. And a commentary on the life of Leonardo da Vinci from the lives of the artists, and that was written by Giorgio Vasari. Well, also in that session, and in the other sessions too, we will be looking at sample from the Italian art world in the period to make certain points. But I'll particularly in the fourth session spend some time looking at Renaissance portraiture and what it might suggest about human nature and the cult of the individual personality that begins to develop in this period. So that is what we're going to be doing. Go to the first slide. And the question is, why Renaissance? Here, let me get my pointer up here as I get used to using Zoom in this way. Here's the traditional account. I hope you realize how much trouble I've gone to get at least a half a dozen different shades of yellow, going from the most intense to the least intense. But and according to the traditional account, I won't call it canonical, classical Rome was this high point of wealth and culture. in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Then we proceed through a long period of imperial decadence after the Antonines of the 2nd century, after those emperors. We go into a period of civil war, barbarian incursions. The Huns are at the gates. The armies that defend the empire are largely German to begin with, and the roots of vernacular Latin, which become the vernacular languages of Europe in the medieval period, begin to develop. Finally, the decline and fall, arguably in the 5th century, of the empire, according to the traditional account. Then we enter a period of the barbarized culture of the Dark Ages, if we've all read our Gibbon correctly. And finally, the Middle Ages begins to develop something of a higher culture of its own, but it's an age of faith and very unlike the age of, if you will, rationality that characterized the classical period. And then suddenly, according to the traditional account, we wind up with a 14th century rebirth of classicism. And you have to love my little circle as we go from light yellow to very intense yellow, because it is a rebirth. And representatives of it really believed that they were on to something new and special. And so with a bullet, they claimed the prestige of their own cultural development. And what I'm going to suggest is that traditional account is misleading. And with that, let's go back and examine some of the elements that I suggest are a bit misleading as we lead up to the period in question. So here you have a map of Europe at the death of Charlemagne. We're in the 9th century. The Carolingians, beginning with Charlemagne, Charles the Great's grandfather, have begun to slowly unify the areas that we now think of as France, part of Germany, Alsace-Lorraine, northern Italy, and over here. But the Mediterranean is largely cut off because North Africa is Islamic. The caliphates, the various caliphates are in place. The Near East is largely Islamic at this point in time. But as of 750, you have an emirate at Cordoba, and Spain is at least 2/3 under the control of the Muslim world. So given the fact that the Mediterranean is in the hands of Saracen naval elements, and that the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire of the East, not so much the Holy Roman, but the Byzantine Empire, has been shrinking vastly ever since the 7th century, when the Arab armies stormed into Syria and Palestine, and will continue to impinge upon the Byzantine world, which has really been cut off from Western Europe because of their concerns with their borders to the south, their borders to the east, their borders to the north. Slavic tribes have begun to move into the region, various tribes that succeeded the Gothic elements that went into Italy and Spain. 200 years earlier. So Charlemagne's world, which, and this makes it look like it's really a consolidated empire, is really far from that. It's a world that is very decentralized, as I point out up in the upper right of the slide. It's been de-urbanized, and we'll get to a slide that illustrates this very strongly. It's dominated by localism and isolation. The peasantry of whatever region you are in Western Europe is essentially at the disposal of the local landlords. And the local landlords are usually strong men who have allegiance perhaps to Charlemagne or perhaps to some other warlord in the region who's flexing his muscle at the expense of the court of Charles. And it's a world of isolation. It's a world in which people probably never ventured more than 20 or 30 miles ever in their lifetime from the place that they were born into. Let me make sure this is off. Okay, we'll stop phones from ringing. That's one of the prices you pay in the world of Zoom. It's the beginning of a feudal society, which simply means that political organization is now working in a hierarchical network in which small landholders who can yield a sword or bring other fighters to bear pledge allegiance to a liege lord who's nearby in exchange for certain protections and for certain indulgences like support in times of war. And that this military organization sits on top of a world of serfs whose instrument is not the sword, but the plow. So you have this military class of lords and vassals, a serf class of farmers and churchmen with their crosses, who really, as we're going to see, are the, and I mentioned it here, are the ones that inherit the education and literacy mantle that had been left from the earlier empire. So we have a West that is cut off from the Greek Empire as it had existed at the fall of the West. And you have culture contracting extremely to the point that it was limited to monasteries and episcopal centers, other than, for instance, the court of Charlemagne himself. Libraries are maintained by churchmen, which is going to have tremendous ramifications for the world as we will talk about in a moment. Let me clear that and this and go. Okay. Whoop. I've got to get back up to my annotations and do clear all. There we go. Okay, next slide. So, to this issue of the contraction of literacy in monasteries. Monastic life, beginning in the 6th century within the Roman period, was largely an Egyptian and Syrian development. It begins to spread into Italy and France by really the 5th century. And at which point the West of Europe is beginning to become isolated from
This is the background.
the connection to the Byzantine East, where the monastic tradition had begun. So it develops new forms of Latin monasticism on its own. They spread like wildfire as the High Middle Ages develop. I'm just showing you, I showed a map. The map would not have looked like this in an earlier period, but by 1300, you can see how Italy and Western Europe are just covered by the Benedictine monasteries of Cluny, so-called Cluniac monasteries, or the Cistercian white monks. The Benedictines were black monks, as they were called. Or you'll see in England, in London, you've crossed Blackfriars Bridge. And here are the White Friars. And you see how these little centers of culture will come to predominate. But they come to predominate in a world that is entirely clerical in focus. So if you look at the bullets on the lower left part of the slide, it's a selective presentation. Classical texts are copied selectively, usually of philosophical and theological interest to Christian theory only. Whoop. I've got a new very live mouse here. And if I can get my pointer back. So the texts that tended to get copied in monasteries were ones that had particular theological interests. So yes, St. Augustine would get copied. St. Ambrose would get copied. St. Paul would get copied from the classical period. But no one was much interested in copying Lucretius. No one was much interested in copying Cicero. Those writers did not speak to that world. Roman writers of political and civic theory are entirely ignored because, as in this box, as I've encapsulated here, there's nothing comparable to Roman Republican or imperial society in the West. There's nothing like that. Suddenly, it's a world of knights, serfs, monks, and local uneducated priests for the most part. But that's entirely a different audience. And so the interest and what you would copy is set by the interest of that audience. Now, the monastic scriptoria, we have a picture here. A scriptorium was a place for reading, writing, copying books. And this is how manuscripts, and by the way, as early as the 6th century, a lot of the manuscripts began to leave scroll form that had been very popular in the Roman period and entered codex form, what we would call the book, the fold-out book. But these were still dominantly made from vellum and were elaborately and created with great difficulty. They produce manuscript copies, produce and maintain in only the major monastic centers. Some little monastery that was struggling to barely grow, it's a subsistence agricultural society, barely able to feed itself and maybe some of the poorer elements in their neighborhood, probably didn't have a chance to do much in the way of scriptoria. But the rich monastic centers, and here by their habits, we see some Cistercians copying away. They probably focused, again, on religious and patristic writers, the fathers of the church. And they were only really focused on Latin texts. Greek essentially disappears as a usage. In the Roman world, anyone educated had some Greek. It was like being in the privileged class in England in the 19th century. You knew at least some kitchen French. It was just the mark of the educated member of that class. This completely disappeared. The use of it disappeared. There were Greek manuscripts left that were preserved in many of these monasteries, but the people who could read them were no longer there. Could they have gotten Greek speakers from Constantinople? Well, they weren't really in much contact with Constantinople. There was a little contact, not much, and there was no interest and no practical usage. And so it disappears. And with it disappearing as a language, of course, is its interest in the Eastern Empire tends to disappear. Now, another comment on the scriptoria, which will have great bearing on the humanist development later on, is that it was very, very expensive to have one scribe copy one text. Anybody familiar with copying Torah or Talmud in the Jewish world, where they've got to be letter perfect and it's one person making a copy, understands why the expense of a new Torah is just spectacular. Well, what they did in many of the scriptoria in the monasteries was have a reader. And the reader would be copied by half a dozen, 10 maybe, scribes who lost concentration, made marginal notes, misheard what they wrote down, any number of things, produced texts that were frequently departures from the master text that was being read. Later on, the texts that they produced would be traded with other monasteries. Oh, we have a copy of Ambrose's sermons from Milan in the 4th century. Can you send us your copy of Jerome's letters? Sure, we'll exchange manuscripts. Once that exchange took place, copies in Monastery B that had just gotten the one manuscript with its mistakes from Monastery A then went through another layer of copying of that manuscript, preserving the mistakes from the one that they had received. So later on, when the Renaissance humanists developed the science and art of philology, people will understand that they have got to begin to build trees of manuscript to understand, if they didn't have an original that they could go back to understand when a mistake, what was a mistake, and when it entered the tradition, and when it would be useful to back up to an earlier version. They began to understand how you build these trees of manuscripts trying to come back to an ur-text or a master text that you could say was closer to an original. And and this is what they've come to call subsequently the critical text. So Charlemagne and the Carolingians, in a not so dark ages, are an example of an early Renaissance. It's Frankish German, the Holy Roman Empire, as he begins to call it, and they make positive contributions to what will be Western culture, and that will be inherited by the Italian Renaissance, one of which was the use of what's called Carolingian minuscule, which is a script for manuscripts based on modern Roman lower case. And you'll see an example of minuscule with letters that you can recognize. Tremendous improvement in readability. We'll see what happens to these over time. But the scribes at Charlemagne's court were interested in standardizing text when they could. This does not go everywhere. Not everybody is doing this, but it becomes a major contribution. Charlemagne brings to his court scholars from France, from England. Alcuin of York, a famous master scholar, comes to organize education at the court of Charlemagne. Lupus of Ferrier becomes a master at instructing new armies of scribal copyists in trying to find legitimate original texts that were worth passing on, and made great contributions in the direction of coming up with what I referred to earlier as texts. But the main purpose at the court of Charlemagne was to develop better Latinists. Court scribes were desired who could read and write High Latin, because the regional Romance dialects had already developed. In fact, when we get to about the year 820, Charlemagne has died. It may have been a little later than that. And the kingdom is being divided into three parts and given to three grandsons. And one grandson in the region east of the Rhine River is speaking a dialect that we have copies of in the agreed document that institutionalized the division of the empire, that looks like early German. But next to it in another column is what his cousin on the other side of the Rhine River would have understood. And it's a kind of proto-French Romance language, certainly not yet French, but certainly not Latin. And in fact, the grandsons, who would have been military lords, of course, and not educated scribes. In fact, there's reason to believe that maybe Charlemagne himself wasn't entirely literate. The grandsons probably could not understand each other, having grown up in local dialects in two different areas of what was then called the Holy Roman Empire. So the interest of Charlemagne in trying to maintain a high level of court Latin went a long way. Did it maintain itself? Well, it did in certain monastic traditions, but like I said, this is a world of extreme localism and the breakdown of centralized places of education. Basically, if you went to a monastery, you went to a monastery to stay at a monastery. You weren't going to a monastery as in later periods, you would go to the University of Paris or Oxford, where you were there to pick up the lingua franca, which would then be dispersed throughout wherever you traveled and wherever you intended to bring the light of education. Basically, the monasteries were inward looking, and the only thing that escaped the dark holes of the monasteries were the manuscripts themselves. And we have copies here, sample copies, of manuscript and codex pages from the period of Charlemagne. You can imagine when you look at the artwork on these pages, what it took to produce one of these in terms of manpower, sheer manpower, or this illustration, this illumination of Charles receiving a book from maybe Alcuin, whom we know had a tonsure and was a Benedictine, and that might be him in the upper right. So we can see the expense it took. So basically, what I want to impress upon us at this point is that, yes, there had been a fall of the empire, but this is not the dark ages that you get in the kind of quasi-mythic popularizations like the Game of Thrones. This is a world that still is trying to maintain high culture when it can. In the 10th century, there is a second Renaissance, the Renaissance of the Saxons on the German side of the border, if you will, of Otto, the Emperor Otto, and his son Otto II, who may have been actually a grandson, I'm not sure of that. But in the 10th century, there is another Renaissance. There is a close alliance of the imperial throne with church institutions, and the imperial court culture uses Latin as its court language, the way later on in the early modern period, the court of the Russian czars would use French, court of Catherine the Great as a court language. Here it was using Latin, and indeed, many of the churchmen, the non-monastic churchmen in the Saxon world, could have been members of the aristocracy. So you got these bishop princes in Germany, these counts of the empire who were often archbishops. So when you get into a later medieval period and you hear that the bishop of such and such is leading an army over into the Tyrol or wherever, it doesn't come as a surprise that the bishop would be leading an army. Northern Italy is brought into the sphere of the Holy Roman Empire. And remember, Northern Italy in the late Roman period was largely the province of German elements, mixing with Roman elements. But, you know, Lombardy, for instance, Lombardia was the homeland of the Langobards, who were also in southern Italy, and the Gothic elements dominated the northeast and the central regions of Italy. We even have a figure, I threw her in because she becomes such an interesting historic figure, Roswitha of Gandersheim, who becomes actually in 20th and 21st century feminism a kind of an icon because she wrote about women's self-determination. She was a poet, she wrote plays, she was a historian, she was a good Latinist, and from what we can tell, she's the first woman author we have found among the Germans, but she becomes an interesting figure. Now, they do have some contact with Byzantium at the court level, and they become interested in elements of Byzantine art and architecture. And so you see examples of churches. We have St. Michael's of Hildesheim at the bottom left, St. Kyriakos and Gernrode. This little icon on the lower right of Otto II, it just smacks of Byzantine influence. It looks like a Byzantine icon of sorts. That architecture is I imagine has some influence on later Gothic, but I don't know, we would need an architectural historian to tell us more about it. But it's a kind of combination of Romanesque and things that they saw going on in Constantinople at the time. And then we come to a 12th century Renaissance, and arguably a flowering of culture that I would suggest rivals and maybe even outpasses the 14th century Renaissance in many ways. It develops pure Gothic architecture, which is a massive technical breakthrough. And I included this little picture of Sainte-Chapelle, which I hope you've had an opportunity sometime in your lives, or that we will all sometime again when we're able to travel, have an opportunity to look at again, whereby in an attempt to allow light into the church, they created these huge windows in the side walls, which in Romanesque architecture are load-bearing. And then after the trials in which several of these attempts collapsed, they stumbled on developments like the flying buttresses, which I didn't picture here, but that to hold up the walls that lead to these high arches, these Gothic arches up at the top. And so they could counterbalance stability with the apertures that they needed to let in light. And the master architects who built the early Gothic cathedrals did so through a lot of trial and error. I don't know whether they really understood the physics of load-bearing elements completely, but they figured out enough practical stuff to be able to build these things, and it was an immense breakthrough. In this period, also in the 12th century, there is an enormous expansion of libraries and manuscript production. And this indeed is the heyday of the great monastic congregations of Cluny and Citeaux, the Cistercian abbeys that proliferate of Citeaux, which become, when they come to North America, the abbeys of Citeaux become what we call Trappists because of La Trappe in France when they come over to the United States and Canada later in the, whenever they come, 18th or 19th century. The monks of Citeaux, including an early abbot Robert in the 1090s, right about the time of the First Crusade, becomes very interested in developing a better translation of the Bible, and realizes that he doesn't have the language to make great use of the documents that the earliest documents that they do have at their disposal. So he sends Cistercian representatives to, and I'll talk about this in a minute, to Toledo and Cordoba in Spain, where there are schools of translators. You'll see in a lower bullet on this page, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, and where there is an elite culture of Arabic scholars and Jewish rabbis, who are also Arabic scholars, who are able to master the various languages needed to look at problems that the monks are having, trying to translate, looking for better translations of Jerome's Latin translations of Old Testament sources. So they get help with Greek, and they get help with Hebrew and the Arab translations of some of it help out. And so you get the beginnings of Western Europe in a more advanced period. Now, and I'm going to go back and talk about why it's more advanced at this point. In the 12th century, looking to expand the base of scholarship for the first time, really, in the West. So there's a flowering of philosophical, theological, legal, and scientific thought. This is the age of, at the beginnings of some of the great university centers are going to begin out of this period and lead us into the next century with the heyday of early Oxford and early University of Paris, for instance. But in this period, as I say, in fact, let's return to it now. There's this translation movement that is taking place. Greek and Arab science, medicine, and philosophy is being translated into Latin. Access to Plato and Aristotle and their sources, discovery of Arabic philosophy, Avicenna and Averroes, and improved translations of biblical material. The translation schools are in Toledo and Palermo, actually, under the Normans, who had recently dominated the Islamic sultans of Palermo, just really a century earlier. And now we're getting interested in modeling their court after the high courts of Spanish Islam. And we'll come back to this translation movement because I'll have other observations and slides later on that have bearing on this. So there's a high medieval intellectual life and a huge age of creativity. The focus is theology and philosophy. Plato and Neoplatonism, people who follow Plato but do so with some strange new ideas, which we will be talking about later on, was the source of much early Christian theology. So for instance, St. Augustine in the 4th and early 5th century bases a lot of his theology on Plato. But Aristotle was a figure who was the source for much Arabic philosophy. And this becomes of great interest in the High Middle Ages to people in Spain and in France and in Italy and in England, for that matter, before there actually is an England or a France as we've come to know it, or a Spain as we've come to know it, and certainly not in Italy. But Aristotle, which was Aristotle and the original sources, was almost completely lost in Western Latin after the fall of Rome. They had some of Aristotle's logic and very little else. They had none of the physics and none of the metaphysics and none of the politics and none of the poetics. And there was great interest in all of this, particularly to Thomas Aquinas, who becomes one of the great Aristotelians at the University of Paris, following the great C.J. of Brabant, and the great Jewish philosopher and intellectual Moses Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, who, by the way, writes his great guide to the perplexed in Arabic, because that's the world he lives in, and later winds up leaving Spain and moving back through Morocco, winds up back in Egypt. A lot of Sephardim, Jews from Spain, will over the next few centuries wind up relocating to other parts of the world for all sorts of reasons, as we'll point out. But what I'd like to mention about this Renaissance, and here's where the humanists are going to object to things that occurred in this period. Latin in this period was extended and used as a technical language to accommodate radical innovations in philosophical thought. These guys, people like Aquinas, were on the cutting edge of new ideas. So they weren't interested in classical Latin for the sake of classical Latin. They changed the language. They grew the language and to be able to express technically new philosophical ideas. The literary Latin that was so prized, as we will see, by the humanists, was simply not a consideration. The historians, poets, political thinkers of Rome were just not important to these guys. But it's a great revolutionary period of the mind in the 12th century and into the 13th century. So now, beginning to explain why we get what we get in the 14th century, let's begin to look at some of the demographical underpinnings. First of all, and this is, as you see, circa 1300. Here, let me get my little pointer back here again. Okay, here's our little pointer. Okay, 3 periods of significant urbanization. North and central Italy, okay? The period, or the area of northern France, Belgium, Brabant, southeastern England, which was a kind of an economic ecosystem of its own, and southern Spain around Cordoba. So what do we know? The area in Spain is part of a different universe, a universe that points south and east. It's not even on this map, to the rest of the world of Islam. So we're now limited to the regions of northern France and Italy. The towns that are the red squares, you see, are towns with 50,000 plus. That's all. In other words, Montclair would have come close to making the status of a red square. For instance, the yellow guys are 10 to 50,000, things that we would barely register as towns in our world. And this was after a period of extreme economic development. This is, and from about the year 1000 to certainly the year 1100, certainly by then, to the year 1300, there was an incredible economic expansion of the Western world, what was going to become Europe. But it was concentrated in 2 areas, the wool trade and textile development trade, which was this French, English, Dutch universe, and the area in northern and central Italy that was essentially a trade system poised between, I'm going to show it to you on the next slide, between Constantinople and the Islamic ports that catered to the spice road coming out of Asia, so that premium goods and silks from China and all that sort of thing, deluxe goods could be routed through the Italian cities and traded for woolens and the like with the area of northern France. Italy began to assume a very special function in the economy of the Western world, and for that matter, in the economy of the Eastern world. Now, characterizing both the French area and the Italian area were that many of these cities were relatively independent, by which I mean free of imperial control, which is going to bear a lot on the development of the Renaissance, as we will see in the subsequent slide. I will mention that demographically, Rome at the height of the empire may have been, you get arguments that it was as many as 1 million people. I've seen the low estimates suggesting it was 300,000 or 400,000. You'll notice on this map in 1300, the city of Rome is not even 50,000 by demographic estimates. Naples is, because Naples is a great trade city with Palermo, and this is part of this a new southern world that's a counterpoise to the Holy Roman Empire up here. This is the world of the Normans, who have cousins in England and who see their interests as rivaling the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, I will turn my pointer off for a second and we'll come to the next slide. Okay, why Italy? So, first of all, trade. If you look at the map on the lower right of the screen, location, location, location. The port cities, which happen to be republics of particularly Genoa, up here if you go to the map on the left, and Venice, dominate trade with the East. In fact, the Genoese make it into the Black Sea. The Venetians establish a Venetian colony along, well, you'll see it on this map here. Here, let me get my little pointer again. It's easier when we do this in class. Oh, there's the spotlight. So the Dalmatian Coast was part of the Venetian Empire, this coast that is now Croatia. Up until really the end of World War I, a lot of this was still part of Italy and Italian speaking. And it was only when they traded at the end of World War I, the Tyrol, the German-speaking part of Italy in the north, and gave up Dalmatia, that this resorted to sort of Slavic Austro-Hungarian control, and the region, the Trento and above, and Bolzano, became part of Italy. If you travel through the Dolomites in Italy, you've discovered that they still want to speak German to you first, and some of them would like to leave Italy altogether. I'm sure that's even more the case these days. So if we come to the larger map, Kingdom of Sicily, which controls the Kingdom of Naples. In fact, it will become the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, as they will call it later on, controlled the south. The papacy, with a number of generals at its disposal will control the so-called papal states in the middle of Italy. Siena is a republic, Florence is a republic, Modena is a duchy, Genoa is a republic, Venice is a republic, Milan is a duchy. And when I say duchy, that means there's a duke. And the duke usually has to swear allegiance either to the emperor or whoever he decides is his liege lord. The republics are try to be standalone and independent. And the question that I raised at the top of the slide, why Italy? Why should Italy be the center of the Renaissance? Two sets of reasons. One set is political. There's no dominant political or commercial entity, distributed power centers. So you have France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy all contending to get control over the elements of northern Italy. So all these places they make treaties with the King of France, or they make a treaty with the Holy Roman Empire. And it's this period in which, in all of these republics in Italy, there are two parties. The papal party, the Ghibellines, and the party of the Guelphs. The names come from two German families in the Holy Roman Empire, the Welfs and the Weiblingens. Italians had tremendous trouble with German, as they still do, so it comes out the Guelfi and the Ghibellini. And in any of these cities, you get people who are, it's sort of like the US Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives with K Street. You get those people bought off by one side of a power struggle and those politicians who are bought off by the other side. And so while these things are republics, the republicanism, Florence was always a hotbed of contention by which the various parties, supported by outside money, would align and realign. And there was a lot of shifting of allegiances and shifting of interests. Whoops, I keep on, come back. So there's no dominant political entity. And there are these free city-states and republics with all their shifting alliances. So it became a place rife for what was going to come to pass, as we will see. And then there are these commercial reasons. The control of Mediterranean trade produces great wealth, and these cities become major banking centers. So it becomes the age of the great banks, particularly in Florence and Genoa, but also in Venice. And to the point that the Holy Roman Empire or the King of France will show up to talk to the Strozzi and the Bardi to see if they can get a loan to carry on, God knows what they're going to carry on, a war or whatever. And so you've got these independent courts, lots of them, that each become flowering centers of wealth, banking, commercial activity, and education. And local forms. We don't need monasteries so much. So there is this cultural transition in 14th century Italy. And here on this map, I call it the Renaissance heartland. Okay, this is really the area. You can go into any town pictured in any region shown at this part of the map and find artworks in little local churches by people you can't believe have artworks in these little local churches. You wander into a church and you'll see a masterpiece that the Metropolitan or the Louvre would kill themselves to have in some little village church. But this society, this new commercially based, urban, Republican society is a society in transition, and it has new requirements. And its first business is the business of diplomacy. We need scribes. We're engaged in writing letters, treaties, court invitations, etc. So we need clerks of this level of literacy. And then there is the business of business. We need clerks to draft contracts, letters of credit, commercial proposals, and not one a day. This is a hotbed of commercial activity. We don't have computer systems. We need lots of people with a requisite level of the universal language in the West, Latin, not the local languages. Remember, Italian did not exist in this period. There were vernaculars, but each of these little regions had its own, what we would now call dialects, but they were their own local languages. The local Florentine Tuscan, because of Dante, begins to catch on as a kind of dialect that more people get interested in because it's the first one that develops a literary expression and so comes to dominate, and it becomes Italian. But you will still find in Italy, if you wander into some town in Sicily or in the Campania or just anywhere. I was with some friends having lunch in Mantova, Mantua, up here in the north. And if you look up in north central, I need my pointer again. Where's my little pointer? Here's my little arrow. Here's Verona. My friend grew up next to Verona, and now we were down here in Mantova having lunch. And at the next table was a group of university students. And I could hear them talking because I was the one at our table closest to them. And I turned to my friend, who is Veronese, and I said, "What language are they speaking?" And she said, "They're speaking Mantovano." I said, "Can you understand it?" She said, "Not at all." And she grew up 30 miles away. Now, all of these people, of course, speak perfect Italian, but left to their own devices, they might speak a local dialect. So the business of business, you need clerks who speak Latin and can write a good hand, have the requisite penmanship. They don't need to be able to discourse on the metaphysics of Aristotle. They don't need to be able to explain the Arab philosopher's concept of agent intellect. They've got to explain how the letters of credit need to be exchanged for silver or gold at such and such a location at such and such a date. So they don't need the university level of education, but they need a kind of literacy useful to the function that they were being asked to fulfill. And of course, there's the business of culture. Poets and artists who need to ornament the Italian courts and houses of the great families. So in effect, for reasons of diplomacy, business, and culture, we need a whole group of people educated not in the way they would be educated at the University of Paris or Bologna, and not in the way they would have been educated in the grand mother house of Citeaux or Cluny or Portsmouth Abbey. The traditional educational methods, models, and institutions are going to be inadequate. The medieval focus on monastic schools, philosophical disputation, and devotional source material doesn't serve the new urban capitalist society and its requirements. Moving along. So, the Italian city-states are going to be a new source of patronage. And they are going to be able to fund these new developments. And it's going to occur mainly at the banking centers. It's going to be in Florence, and it's going to be in Genoa, and it's going to be in Venice. It's not an accident that no matter where they come from, a Michelangelo Buonarroti or a Leonardo da Vinci go to the places where the money is. There are these eminent commercial and banking families, the Bardi, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Rucellai. There are these urban courts. They're at Milan, the courts of the Visconti and then the Sforzas. And Mantova, the Visconti family again. At Ferrara, the Este family. At Urbino, the Malatestas. These are dukes, ducal families who are educated by the new scholars that they're going to bring to their courts. They're going to bring the best of these new scholars to educate the court and its minions in what is going to be useful to the banking concerns, to the aristocratic concerns, and to the business world of their world. The families of Rome and the Papal States have the Colonna family, the Farnese, the Orsini, the Medici, the Borgias. Patronage of literature and art is now sponsored by civic and commercial interests, not just by monastic and ecclesiastical entities. And so I give you two pictures at the bottom. On the lower left, we've got a little picture of the Medici Bank. On the lower right, I love this picture, the Gonzaga Court at Mantova by Mantegna. And of course, it's a classic court picture of everybody done to the nines. And of course, everybody in this picture would get educated by the best that money could buy and brought to the court. So there's a shift in the 14th century. And it isn't, and I really want to stress this, it isn't like 14th century humanism, people woke up out of the blue one day and said, ooh, let's have a renaissance. I'm interested in classical individualism. No, there were these reasons that brought them back to the documents of Rome. Because if you are going to educate a new army of clerks, political leaders, and diplomats in what they need to know linguistically and what kind of cultural background they need to be useful to those functions, they don't need to be reading the sacred literature that is my list on the left. You don't decide that you need a bank teller and give them the sermons of Pope Gregory the Great to use as a model, or the monastic mystic Meister Eckhart, or the mystical songs of Hildegard of Bingen, or the philosophy of Peter Abelard or Bonaventure from the University of Paris. That you might be doing that at the University of Paris or Bologna, but you're not going to be doing it in the court schools. You want people to learn how to write a good business letter? Give them Quintilian. Give them Cicero. Give them Pliny the Younger, who write great letters. We have all these wonderful correspondences in Roman literature. And this stuff was there. It was in the libraries. So suddenly the shift is entirely for stylistic concerns. Letter and business writing, contracts and legal documents, literary models. There was, and now in this first enclosed, whoops, I keep on, and this first enclosed box that I have on this page, up in here, and I can't stress this enough, there was no attitude shift that caused the Renaissance. There was a shift in practice that caused the Renaissance. Attitudes secularized, people secularized, because the educated were reading secular writing. They didn't start reading secular writing because they had a change in attitude. They had a change in attitude because they started reading secular writing. That in effect, the result of the new methods of education turned people into largely the humanists that we think of them as. All the interest in individual self-development that you never find in monastic literature, but that you look at the portraiture of the Renaissance and you're startled by it. But it isn't that people woke up on a Tuesday morning with changed opinions. They just spent 5 years reading Cicero, Seneca, Quintilian, Virgil, and Ovid, and you come out the other end and you're thinking differently. An interest in humanism is a result, not a cause of Renaissance. And so, one little click. Do you remember Marshall McLuhan? I think most people in this class are old enough to remember Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message. In effect, and McLuhan was trying to argue that television became its own message. Television changed the way human thinking worked. What I'm suggesting here is that the educational source material of this new world became the message, changed the way people thought about the world. Okay, now, 14th century interest in all things Roman extends to visual arts. So I just went rummaging through and picked up some Roman visual art to throw in the slide. The Roman art, as I say at the bottom of the screen, Roman artifacts had never disappeared. There was simply little interest in representational art in the Middle Ages. Yes, did they lose techniques? Sure, they lost techniques. Did they try to get those techniques back even when in the period of early urbanization began to allow them to develop the leisure time for that kind of stuff? Not so much. They could see this stuff around them if they lived in certain parts of the world. But as I pointed out here, it's a shift in emphasis. So here are two pietas, a medieval one and you know whose. And it's a shift from message art to representational art. As I say in the bottom of the screen, classical technique had been lost as the cultural world contracted, but the medieval focus was on the next life, the afterlife. The loss of the technique was of little concern. The individual human body in medieval art is a cipher. It's part of the message. It's not the goal. You're telling a narrative story, a religious narrative story. And here's Jesus. Everybody takes one quick peek, on the left of this sort of medieval emaciated image of Christ. Oh yeah, I know who that is. I got the message. I got the biblical references. I understand what I need to understand. When you look at the Pietà, you glory in the humanity of the representational image. Does it have a religious content? Yes, but it has this profoundly human element that gets contextualized when you realize who these guys have been reading and what they're learning to become interested in. So with the Roman revival, I'm going to go for about 5 minutes more, then we can maybe open it to some questions and stuff. With the Roman revival, I've thrown up 3 depictions of the Lamentation of Christ. Christ's been taken down from the cross, the dead body is there. And as you see, going from left to right, they get more, if you will, human and less like symbolic discourse. The medieval one is an abstraction. The message is completely there. With the Giotto, who's sort of a proto-Renaissance figure, but not quite, you see, and he's got heavy influence from Byzantine iconography. You see that there's this developing interest in and getting closer to a physical representation. By the time you get to the Mantegna and the Quattrocento, I mean, look at it. I mean, look at the drapery over the legs. I mean, you're way beyond the content of the message at this point. So there are continuities with medieval practice. Whoops. Oh, somebody's got a question. I'll tell you what, just give me another minute. We'll be done with this part in just a sec. So the continuities with medieval practice, the subject matter is still religious. In fact, many people in the Renaissance who we think of as secular humanists are actually very religious. There's still gospel and Old Testament themes, and there is still the intensity of feeling that you get out of the medieval iconography. But there's continuities with classical practice as well. The individual human body in and of itself is of interest, and form over substance, the message can become subordinate. And then I believe, let me just check. Yeah, good. Whoop, I just want to go back. Good. My last slide for this lecture. And I just pulled up this Piero della Francesca's Flagellation of Christ, not to talk about perspective, but to talk about the way his interests in technical, I mean, look at this picture. The Flagellation of Christ is the topic, and there it is in the background. It becomes an excuse for this employing of technique. And so it's completely out of the spirit of what we would have expected earlier. With this, I'm going to stop the share so we can go back to seeing. Okay, everybody left. If anybody's got any questions, I'm going to, I'd say unmute yourself and ask, or type the question and people will be able to see it. Does everybody know how to unmute themselves? I can, in fact, I can come in here and I have now just unmuted everybody. You're all on the air.
Okay.
As we speak.
Unmuted. So now when we say he can hear.
You hear Vic?
And if someone's speaking, they're not speaking loudly enough. Does anybody have a comment or a question? I would say if you can use the chat, bottom. That might be the best way to bring a question to people's attention. Okay, Joan Kaplan has a question. You're welcome, Mr. Boyle.
Be back. Sorry. Huh?
43 people.
Oh, somebody, okay, so we have a couple. Is there a book I'd recommend on the history of the Renaissance? A single book, it depends what aspect of it. I would say what I'll do at the end of this lecture series, after the 4, what I'll try to do is come up with a recommended list that'll cover different aspects of what we'll be talking about, because there's so many different things. I mean, there are books, there are libraries on things like the use of magic in the Renaissance, for instance. What I'm going to do, by the way, for people who haven't had me in classes here before, is I'm going to send out the slides that I used this morning as a PDF. So you can go over them again. And by the way, this has been recorded. And I think everybody is going to be given access to it again at some point. I'm not so sure how people are doing it.
That's great.
But let's see, are any more questions coming up in chat?
Type something too.
I've sent you out some PDFs. I've scheduled some readings that are very short. Some of them are 2 or 3 pages, just to give you a flavor of some things that I'll be addressing. Some of them will probably look fairly closely at when we get the opportunity, especially in the 4th session, when we're looking at Machiavelli. Machiavelli's worth looking at very closely. It says a lot about current politics as practice. And, well, if there aren't,
I'm working on a question.
oh, I see a couple people trying to, I can't,
Try to talk my question.
yeah, Judy, speak up louder.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to review what you said to clarify it. You pointed out that the change in the worldview and the cultural changes came about because of a change in the education that educated people were receiving.
Yeah.
And but prior to that, you also pointed out that the change in education came in order to meet the new economic demands. The new
urban and commercial interests in that particular part of the world.
In that particular part of the world. So, and what I'm just trying to do is see if you would say then that the economic took precedence.
Well, yeah, it did in a sense, in that it changed the technology, if you will.
Technology, okay.
And we'll see, what we're going to be looking at next time is what, to some degree, part of what we're going to be looking at next time is what was that technical change? How were things being taught that made, not just what texts were being used and the like, but how were they using them? And what were the techniques that they asked students to apply that turned out different people, if you will, than would have been found in other places at other times. Well, anybody else? So it's not like being in the big room at the library, but I like seeing your cheery faces.
I sent you a chat, Lou.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
And the sun is out.
Okay, so
Hi, Harold.
I did.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Lou.
Okay, I want to respond to this one question that's being asked here. Someone asked in the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. At the 6th century, there was a lot of Irish monastic copying. It is partially true that Irish monasteries had copies of a few things that couldn't be found on continental libraries, some Greek sources and the like. But it never really entered the mainstream later on, that the bulk of the monastic copying was done on the continent. The bulk that was useful to the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. There must have been some Greek reading Irish monks in the 7th century. A man named John Scotus Erigena was one of them. And we don't know how he got Greek literacy along the Irish coast in the 600s, but he did somehow. So that is lost. Maybe there was a venture in Constantinople that brought a teacher up there. We don't know. Anyhow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lou.
Anybody else? Any other?
No.
Thank you, Lou.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lou.
Okay.
Thank
So-
you.
Next week, gang, I'm going to end the meeting now. I guess the link will be there always. They
We'll be there.
find out how they're sending it out every week, so we can all do this. And a chat popped up. Okay.
Oh.
See everybody next.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.